Welcome to the Biomedical Podcast, the podcast that connects groundbreaking research with real-world answers. I'm Dr. Bensada, and in every episode, we examine new published articles to take a close look at the discoveries that are changing how we see science. We aim to fire up your interest and start a talk that goes beyond the lab. Welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're going deep into the world of carbon nanotubes and all the really wild ways they're being used in medicine. You sent us all these research articles, and it's amazing to see how these tiny little tubes might revolutionize how we treat everything, from cancer to even things like rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah, we've been digging into all this research on carbon nanotubes and biology and medicine, and honestly, the field is just exploding with possibilities right now. It's pretty exciting stuff.
So for you listening out there, we're going to try to break down all these complex scientific findings in a way that makes sense. We want to give you a clear picture of how these nanotubes are being used to create these super precise therapies and even combine treatment approaches. We're going to steer clear of all the crazy technical jargon and really focus on those aha moments. The stuff that makes you think, wow, that's actually really clever, and what it could mean for the future of medicine. So first up, carbon nanotubes as drug carriers. What's the deal with that?
So the basic idea is that these incredibly small tubes can act as vehicles to deliver drugs directly to where they're needed in the body. Think of them as tiny little delivery trucks carrying medicine.
And from what I've seen in these studies, it's not just one type of truck. We've got single-walled carbon nanotubes, or SWCNTs, and multi-walled carbon nanotubes, or MWCNTs. And it looks like scientists are even modifying them to make them even better at their jobs.
Right, exactly. This modification often involves attaching specific molecules to the surface of the nanotubes, a process called functionalization. One example is adding carboxyl groups. And this basically changes how the nanotubes interact with both the drugs and the body. And this often makes them much more effective at carrying and releasing their payload.
Okay, so how do they actually load the drugs onto these nanotubes? It looks like there are a couple of different methods mentioned in the research.
Yeah, so the papers describe two main ways: physical adsorption and covalent conjugation. So physical adsorption is kind of like the drug molecules just sticking to the surface of the nanotube, through natural forces. And then you have covalent conjugation, which is more like chemically linking the drug directly onto the nanotube, more permanently.
And they're loading all sorts of drugs onto these things. We're talking about doxorubicin, daunorubicin, paclitaxel, methotrexate, even Suriname. It's a whole pharmacy on a tiny tube.
Yeah, it really is. And one of the most revolutionary things is the potential for controlled drug release.
Yeah.
So it's not just about delivering the drug, but actually releasing it exactly when and where it's needed, to be most effective.
Yeah, that sounds super important. But how do they control when and where that release happens?
Well, there are some pretty clever approaches being investigated. One promising method is pH-sensitive release. For instance, the area around tumors tends to be more acidic than normal healthy tissue. So they can design nanotubes that release their drugs, specifically in that low pH environment. Another fascinating technique is using near-infrared light, or NIR, to trigger the release. Imagine shining a specific light onto the treatment area, and that light then tells the nanotubes, okay, time to release the drug. There's even this one study that used special particles modified with a dye that responds to light to achieve this really controlled release.
Light-triggered release. That's amazing. It's like having a remote control for drug delivery. So you could target a very specific area and release the medication exactly where it's needed without affecting healthy tissue.
Exactly. That kind of precision could completely change how we approach treating diseases. Imagine dramatically reducing side effects and making therapies much more effective.
So one of the biggest challenges in cancer treatment is drug resistance. When cancer cells just stop responding to the drugs. Do carbon nanotubes offer any solutions to this?
Yeah, they actually might. There's some really cool research suggesting that nanotubes can help overcome drug resistance. For example, with cancer cells that have become resistant to doxorubicin, the nanotubes can actually help the drug get back inside the cell. And there's also evidence that using something called photothermal therapy, which we'll talk about in a minute, in combination with nanotubes can disrupt the cell's mechanisms for pumping out the drug, basically breaking down those defenses.
So it's like the nanotube is a Trojan horse sneaking the drug past the cell's security system. And how do they make sure that these drug-loaded nanotubes actually find the cancer cells in the first place?
That's where targeted delivery comes in. They attach these molecules called targeting ligands to the surface of the nanotubes. These ligands are designed to recognize and bind to specific receptors that are found in high numbers on cancer cells, but not so much on healthy cells, like a lock and key mechanism.
Okay, so give me an example of these molecular keys that unlock those cancer cell locks.
Well, one example is folic acid, or Fa. Many types of cancer cells have a ton of folate receptors on their surface. So by attaching folic acid to the nanotubes, they become much more attracted to those cells. Another example is using peptides, which are short chains of amino acids that contain a specific sequence called RGD. These can target proteins on the surface of new blood vessels that tumors rely on to grow. And there was even a study that used an aptamer, which is like a very specific targeting molecule called SGC8C, and that one targets a protein called tyrosine kinase 7, which is found on certain cancer cells.
So it's like they're giving the drug delivery truck the exact address of the cancer cells. It's incredibly precise. Now let's shift gears and talk about another exciting application, photothermal therapy, or PTT, with carbon nanotubes. It sounds like they're using light to generate heat and destroy those diseased cells.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. So carbon nanotubes are really good at absorbing near-infrared light and converting that light energy into heat. When this happens near cancer cells, the localized heat can selectively kill them, like a very targeted form of heat treatment.
And what kind of temperatures are we talking about? It has to be hot enough to damage the cells, but not so hot that it harms surrounding healthy tissue, right?
The studies mention a range of about 42 to 45 degrees Celsius as being effective for cell destruction, and they usually have to maintain that temperature for a while, like between 15 and 60 minutes to get the results they want.
That sounds like a very carefully controlled process. And I read something about enhancing this PTT effect using gold nanorods. What's that about?
That's really cool stuff. Some studies have shown that attaching gold nanorods, or GNRs, to multi-walled carbon nanotubes significantly boosts their photothermal conversion efficiency, like how well they turn light into heat. One study found almost a 5-fold increase in efficiency. Gold nanorods are also great at absorbing NIR light, so it creates a synergistic effect where you get a major boost in heat generation. And that could mean using lower laser power or shorter treatment times, which is always a good thing.
So it's like adding a turbocharger to the nanotube's heat-generating capabilities. They must have tested this in living organisms, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There are a bunch of promising in vivo studies. One looked at melanoma, which is a type of skin cancer, in mice. They used specially coated nanotubes. And when they exposed these to laser light, they saw a significant reduction in tumor size. Another study focused on bladder cancer in mice. They used nanotubes designed to target a specific molecule found on the cancer cells. And get this. They delivered the nanotubes directly into the bladder and then applied the light.
Delivered directly into the bladder that's so targeted.
Yeah, and they had good results with that approach, too. There was another really interesting study that combined chemo with this photothermal therapy using this whole complex of nanotubes, a dye called Evans blue, a protein called albumin, and the chemo drug paclitaxel. They tested this in mice with a specific type of breast cancer. And this combo therapy worked much better at destroying tumors than either treatment on its own.
That's a powerful combination. And what's the role of that Evans blue dye?
Well, Evans blue is sometimes used in other types of medical imaging, and they found that it's great at helping the nanotubes disperse evenly. It also has this high affinity for albumin, which is a naturally occurring protein in our blood. So basically, it helps the nanotube stay separated and potentially even hitch a ride on the body's own delivery system.
So like it prevents clumping and helps them get around more efficiently. That's really clever. Okay, so if you're generating heat inside the body, how do you make sure it's the right temperature to kill the cancer cells, but not so high that it damages healthy tissue nearby?
Yeah, safety is a huge concern, and the research emphasizes using thermal cameras to monitor the temperature in real time during the therapy. This allows researchers, and eventually doctors, to make sure they're hitting that target temperature without harming healthy tissue. That real-time feedback is essential.
Yeah, definitely crucial for safety and effectiveness. Now, we've talked a lot about cancer, but it's interesting to see that carbon nanotubes might also have a role in treating other things like rheumatoid arthritis. I didn't expect that.
It's a really promising area of research. The idea is to use nanotubes to deliver anti-inflammatory drugs right to the affected joints in diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. So you're targeting the inflammation directly at the source.
And what kinds of drugs are they using for that?
Well, one study mentioned attaching methotrexate, which is a common drug for rheumatoid arthritis, and Surinase that targets a protein called NOTCH1 onto SWCNTs. NOTCH1 is involved in inflammation, so silencing it could have therapeutic effects on the immune cells involved in arthritis, like B cells, neutrophils, and monocytes.
A two-pronged attack. Deliver the drug and block the inflammation pathway.
Exactly. And this study showed that these particular nanotubes carrying this RNA were actually taken up more efficiently by those target immune cells compared to other types of nanotubes, which suggests a level of selectivity within the immune system itself.
Wow, that's incredibly specific targeting.
Yeah.
And they're even using nanotubes to see what's happening inside the joints, right?
Yeah. They're exploring near-infrared 2 fluorescence imaging, or NIR2, with a specific type of single-walled nanotube to actually track how these nanotubes accumulate in the joints of animals with arthritis. This allows them to see where they go and how they interact with the inflamed tissues in real time.
So not only are they delivering drugs, but they can also see the delivery in action, which leads us nicely into our next point.
Okay.
Carbon nanotubes for imaging and diagnosis. It sounds like this NIR fluorescence imaging is a key part of that.
Right. So near-infrared light can penetrate deeper into tissues than visible light, which makes it really useful for seeing beneath the surface. They're using single-walled nanotubes and other nanomaterials that emit near-infrared light to create high-resolution images of blood vessels, including the tiny capillaries in the brain and limbs, as well as the blood vessels supplying tumors. They're even using them to improve sentinel lymph node imaging, which is crucial for tracking the spread of cancer.
Yeah, sentinel lymph node imaging is super important for staging cancer, right?
Definitely. And the studies compare these nanotube-based imaging agents to an existing FDA-approved dye called indocyanine green, or ICG. And it seems like the nanotubes have some advantages, like better stability, solubility, and what they call a higher quantum yield, which basically means they glow brighter and clearer, which could lead to more detailed and accurate images.
So potentially better, more reliable images than what we currently have? And it looks like they're not just focused on single-purpose imaging. They're talking about multifunctional nanomaterials. What are those?
Multifunctional nanomaterials are basically combining imaging, therapy, and drug delivery into a single platform. They call it theranostics. Imagine like one tiny agent that can locate a tumor, deliver drugs to it, and let doctors monitor the treatment progress all at the same time.
That's the dream, right?
Yeah.
Like personalized medicine taken to the next level. Do they have any examples of these platforms?
Yeah, there are a few. One mentioned nanoparticles made of iron oxide and copper sulfide, which they can use for both MRI and PTT. Another one used nanosheets made of molybdenum disulfide, which show promise for CT scans, drug delivery, and also PTT. It's like creating these super versatile microscopic medical tools.
Like having tiny little doctors working inside the body. And I was really interested in the part about using nanotubes to image brown fat. That's the good fat that burns calories, right?
Yeah, that's right. Researchers used SWCNTs that were modified with phospholipids to do NIR photoluminescence imaging of brown adipose tissue in mice. They found that these nanotubes interact with certain proteins in the blood and tend to accumulate in specific areas of brown fat, which allows them to visualize this important tissue in living animals. It could be really useful for studying and maybe even treating metabolic disorders.
That's amazing, using nanotechnology to better understand our metabolism.
Yeah.
But with all this incredible potential, we have to talk about safety. What are the main concerns when it comes to using carbon nanotubes in the body?
Safety is definitely a major concern. There are definitely some potential risks associated with using nanotubes in the body long term. Some studies have shown that they can build up in the reticuloendothelial system, or RES, which includes organs like the liver and spleen. There are also concerns about potential inflammation and granuloma formation, especially with larger nanotubes that tend to clump together. So the body can sometimes see them as foreign invaders.
So like the body's defenses might attack them.
Right. But a lot of research is focused on minimizing these risks. One important strategy is to functionalize the nanotubes with biocompatible molecules like PEG, or polyethylene glycol. Coating them with PEG has been shown to reduce their toxicity and make them less likely to trigger an immune response, like giving them a disguise to avoid the body's defenses.
Makes sense. A smoother, more compatible coating. But research is still ongoing to really figure out any other potential effects, right?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of research happening right now on how nanotubes might affect things like reproductive function and the immune system. These are really important things to understand before we can start using these technologies widely in humans.
Right. We have to make sure these amazing tools are both effective and safe for the long haul. Now, I also saw something about these new carbon nanotube-based hydrogels. That sounds like a pretty interesting material.
It is. Researchers are developing these hydrogels that combine alginate, which is a natural polymer, PNI-PAM, which is a temperature-sensitive polymer, and carbon nanotubes to create these smart gels that can release drugs on demand in response to different triggers.
Multi-responsive hydrogels. What kind of triggers are we talking about?
Well, these hydrogels can respond to pH changes, hydrogen peroxide, temperature, and even near-infrared 2-second light. This responsiveness is due to how the different components interact, including dynamic covalent bonds and the nanotubes themselves.
So you could use all sorts of signals to tell the hydrogel to release a drug. What does the PNI-PAM do?
So PNI-PAM is interesting. It's a polymer that changes its properties depending on the temperature. And when those nanotubes in the hydrogel absorb near-infrared 2-second light, they create heat locally. And this heat causes the PNI-PAM to shrink, which essentially squeezes the gel and pushes the drug out.
It's like a tiny little light-activated pump for drug delivery. Have they tested this?
Yeah, both in the lab and in living organisms. And it looks like these hydrogels can release drugs effectively in response to NIR cleat. So they have a lot of potential as controlled drug delivery systems.
The control these technologies offer over drug release is truly remarkable. Okay, one last topic before we wrap up. Enhancing chemo with carbon nanotubes and hyperthermia. We talked about photothermal therapy earlier, so it seems like this is combining that with traditional chemo drugs.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is to create a synergistic effect. Use that targeted heating from PT2 with nanotubes to make the cancer cells more sensitive to the chemo drugs. The heat can mess with the cells and make the chemo work better.
And there are studies showing this actually works.
Yep. One study showed that using metformin, which is a diabetes drug that also seems to have some anti-cancer effects, combined with localized hyperthermia from multi-walled carbon nanotubes and NIR light, was way more effective at killing liver cancer cells than metformin alone. And of course, they coated the nanotubes with PEG to make them more biocompatible.
So the heat from the nanotubes boosts the effectiveness of the chemo drug. It's like a 1-2 punch.
Exactly. It's a strategy that could potentially allow us to use lower doses of chemo drugs, which would mean fewer and less severe side effects for patients.
This has been such an amazing deep dive into the medical uses of carbon nanotubes. We've covered so much ground. What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think we've seen how incredibly versatile carbon nanotubes are. They can be used for so many different medical applications, especially for targeted drug delivery. We've also explored how their ability to convert light into heat can be used to destroy diseased cells without being invasive. And of course, we saw how they're becoming increasingly important in advanced medical imaging, giving us clearer and more detailed pictures of what's happening inside the body.
There were definitely some whoa moments for me. The way nanotubes can help overcome drug resistance in cancer is huge. Also, the potential for light-activated drug release to really fine-tune treatment. And it wasn't just about cancer. The potential uses for treating inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and even in metabolic imaging of brown fat were super cool and really surprising.
Yeah, I agree. This deep dive really shows how nanotechnology, and carbon nanotubes in particular, is blurring the lines between materials, science, biology, and medicine. It's opening up all these new possibilities for treatments and diagnoses.
So, for everyone listening, remember that this is just a glimpse into a field that's constantly evolving. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you some things to think about. Like how do these tiny tubes interact with individual cells? What are the long-term safety considerations of using these materials in the body?
Yeah.
And how will all this promising research actually translate into real-world treatments?
All really important questions. And the scientific community is actively working on answering them.
Exactly. So one final thought for you to ponder. Nanotechnology, especially the incredible potential of carbon nanotubes, isn't just about making things smaller. It's about fundamentally changing how we interact with biological systems. It could lead to a future where we have highly personalized and incredibly effective therapies. What other amazing applications will we discover as our understanding of these tiny structures grows? That's something pretty amazing to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Stay tuned for a new literature review. Until next time on the Biomedical Podcast.